Cool. We have just gone past 1:15, so we're going to make a start as people can filter in slowly. So kia ora koutou, ka mihi nui kia koutou, ko Craig Cliff toko ingoa, he kai whakahaere o Takahua Waru Kore aho. So I'm Craig Cliff, I'm the Net Carbon Zero Program Manager in the Sustainability Office here at the university. It's really great to have another session here in person in the Terrace Lounge as part of our Summer Scholars Seminar on all things sustainability. There's also a parallel session. If you have joined online, you've got the option of watching this one or another stream in a Zoom only session. And you've clearly found the links to those. So congratulations, you're doing really, really well. So what we're going to be doing today is running through 3 presenters, and then they'll have 15 minutes each. I've got some time cards there to help you know when you've got 5 minutes left, 2 minutes left, and when I'm about to get the hook out and pull you in. And then after the 3 presentations, we'll have a Q&A. And so those of you watching online, I'd invite you to put your questions into the chat, and we'll all be coming up with questions here in the room as well. And then it'll be over and we'll have another break and we'll do another session of 3 presentations here in the room, and that will be the end of our day. So yeah, this session, between lunch and afternoon tea, that's a really tough crowd. You know, people have just eaten. They're starting to get the soporific effect of their lunch. So I'd encourage our speakers to try and break through the wall and make it vibrant, make it exciting. And I know these topics are really exciting. So we've got Cinamin's going to be talking to us about supplier perceptions towards providing surplus food to social enterprises. Olivia's going to talk about archival research on early settler relationship to place. And then we're going to have Jodie talking about green hydrogen and what that might mean, how that's reflected in New Zealand media. We also had on the schedule that Martha was going to be talking about Brazil nut injections for happier cows. Unfortunately, she's been let down by New Zealand's transport system. So linking to earlier presentations today, the planes have let her down. So as of 1:18, we don't think she's going to be able to make it. We may have her coming in all of a sudden, whether virtually or in person, and we'll flex to fit her in. But if not, I'm sure we'll be able to learn more about how to get more selenium into our cows at a later date. So just quickly, because some of you wouldn't have been here in the morning, administratively, if you need the bathrooms, they're out the way that you've come in on that hallway there. Gathering point if there's the need to evacuate the spaces out on the Union lawn, but there's not going to be any disasters like that. We're going to have a great time, and we're going to be really entertained by some good presentations. So without further ado, I'll invite Cinamin to come up.
So I'm Cinamin. My project is on food supply perceptions on the provision of surplus food to a social enterprise. So for important context, what is a social enterprise? Social enterprises are thought of as organizations that adopt business models to achieve their social and/or environmental goals. Social enterprises may use surplus food to address issues of food waste and/or food insecurity. So some examples you might be familiar with. There's the bowling club out in Caversham who work to provide cheap and healthy meals to the community. Perfectly Imperfect and Wonky Box, which rescue fruit and vegetables from growers across New Zealand and redistribute those. So why are we interested in social enterprises using surplus food? Social enterprises offer an alternative to charity-based food rescue and support like a self-sustaining kind of venture where they're not reliant on food donations to meet their goals. So the key differences are the use of a business model. So a social enterprise uses a business model and has a profit goal to meet their social and environmental goals. So there are worries that creation of a secondary market around surplus food will take away from food rescue organizations. However, there is evidence that only a small portion of surplus is currently being redistributed, leaving space for a secondary market for some surplus. So while many businesses donate to food rescue organizations, for various reasons, some companies are not engaging in this process. This project is exploring if there is scope for the redistribution of surplus food to social enterprises via a secondary market to further reduce food waste where this food is not already being donated. So the aim of the project is to gather food industry perspectives on the redistribution of surplus food to a social enterprise. So the intention is to provide insight into food industry considerations to help social enterprises establish relationships procuring surplus food from suppliers. So the project took shape as a qualitative research project consisting of interviews with food suppliers. In order to do this, I got ethics approval from the university, and that was a bit of a process doing the application and writing out like the project overview and the interview guide and things like that. So for the methodology, I attempted to find food suppliers and manufacturers in the Otago region. I did this through a desktop search and also through word of mouth. So recruitment was an introductory email and sometimes a follow-up phone call when I was getting low on responses. Recruitment was the most difficult part of the project for me. I think due to the time of year and also the nature of the questioning, surplus food and food waste can be quite taboo for businesses, and they're not generally that inclined to talk about it. So data collection was semi-structured interviews that took place via Zoom or in person. And the interview guide kind of consisted of questions covering food surplus and waste, current uses for surplus, and then barriers and opportunities to providing surplus, and opinions on social enterprises using surplus food. So the interview recordings were transcribed and then thematically analyzed into the results. So in the end, I had 5 participants, one of which I got between making this slide and presenting now, so their information isn't on here. But there were 2 food manufacturers, 1 food grower, and 1 food distributor / processor, and then another food manufacturer / retailer. So I transcribed and analyzed the interviews. I picked out key concepts, and then I assigned the concepts to categories. So the categories are barriers to the provision of surplus food to a social enterprise, and then opportunities and considerations. So I started with considerations because I think they were the most important. They also incorporate both barriers and opportunities and affect decision-making for businesses. So the first consideration is incentives. So is there enough incentive for forming relationships with a social enterprise? Incentives differ for different companies. The 4 that I picked out as being most important were public perception, community engagement, market creation, and payment. So the food manufacturer, one of the food manufacturers I talked to, part of their business was utilizing surplus fruit. And they said, talking about growers, that I'll be honest, for growers, it's a cost thing if they can get some money for their surplus. This sentiment was reiterated by the other grower I spoke to. Generally, food growers, at least in the Central Otago region, are relatively opposed to giving their food for free because they already see their surplus food as having a market value, and for them it's not something to be given for free. Furthermore, food distributor said that if I put my business hat on, I think, yeah, they would like to be paid for it, but we do have a community focus. And I think most interestingly, they had examples of this incentive actually working. So 3 of the 4 suppliers that I had interviewed when making these slides mentioned the creation of a market for a product that was previously waste had been enough incentive for the company to change their practices and accommodate saving surplus. So for example, this was the saving of kumino skins for making chips, saving overripe apricots and sending them to be dried, and processing grade cherries for juicing. So this shows that market incentives are enough to change behavior in some cases. Another important consideration was cost/benefit analysis. So that's where the businesses are weighing up things like practicality. They say practicality comes around. How easy is it for us to separate out the surplus food? So in other words, is the cost worth the benefit? Similarly, logistics were mentioned a lot in cost/benefit analysis and effective decision making if businesses were considering engaging with social enterprises. So moving on to opportunities, key finding was that secondary market mentioned in incentives. So the biggest affecting factor for businesses was this idea of getting paid for their surplus because it made sense to them. It's something they'd like to have happen. And again, the grower said in terms of donations that donating is more of a once-off, whereas a secondary market for surplus food could be a long-term relationship. They said, if you're donating to a worthy cause, yes, we could probably give something for free, but not bins and bins of it. Further opportunities I identified from the interviews were this idea of enhancing public perception, engaging with the community, internal capacity. So the businesses I spoke to all had space to store and manage surplus if they had a reason or motivation to do so. And another opportunity was a general attitude from the businesses. They were, in most cases, reasonably willing to consider the idea of providing a social enterprise with food. The thing was, they found that the organization of this was an external task, and they generally had this attitude similar to the distributor who said, when speaking of a previous donation to a social enterprise, quote, "I'll be honest with you, that was probably a one-off, but I wouldn't see any reason why we couldn't continue it." They're not currently engaging, but they are willing to, and they don't really see any reason why not. So in terms of barriers, key finding, the most important, I think, was a lack of communication. So one food manufacturer said that a lack of lines of communication and a lack of proactivity on the side of the organizations wishing to utilize surplus food was a barrier and the key reason why they didn't have any relationships currently active with social enterprises. So following from this, there's a lack of communication and a lack of contact. So the wholesale food distributor mentioned that though they had been approached by a food rescue organization in one avenue of their operation, they had many other avenues of surplus that no organization had yet approached them about. Other barriers, logistics, transporting, labor, storage, if they were to separate out surplus that wasn't currently being separated from waste product, which was happening in a lot of business I talked to. A lot of surplus was going to animal feed or just being put in the bin, but some was being donated. So it was also an external capacity as cited as a barrier. They have a quote reluctance internally for small quantities. So like engaging in a relationship where an organization can only take on a small amount of surplus for them didn't make sense logistically. And then consistency can also be a barrier due to the ad hoc nature of surplus and the sometimes overwhelmingly large quantities of one very specific product that maybe made surplus at a certain time, like tons and tons of cherries that are going to perish in a week or two. So in terms of the key takeaways that I got from the interviews and the data, it's important to note that it was a really small sample size, but there are still some interesting things that came out of talking to these people. So while it seemed to me when speaking to these businesses that they made little distinction between donation to a charity versus sale or provision of food to a social enterprise, like in terms of opportunities and barriers, except for a change in cost and benefit analysis and being incentivized by the creation of a secondary market. So I think this change in cost and benefit and incentivization may be the defining factor determining whether some edible surplus food is redistributed or disposed of. So, because though two of the suppliers had ad hoc relationships donating their surplus to charities, none except the one that I interviewed yesterday had consistent relationships with food rescue organizations, and the ones that were donating some of their surplus still had surplus that could possibly be donated but wasn't being separated out from waste. So in all cases, it seemed some edible food was not being separated out from waste due to a lack of incentive and a poor cost/benefit analysis, and also just due to lack of solicitation, which is the next slide. So another key point that I saw coming from talking to these businesses was a lack of communication and a lack of solicitation. So according to studies, solicitation is one of the biggest factors influencing whether donation will occur. And not only is the act of solicitation important, but the way in which solicitation occurs. So this was reiterated by the food manufacturer who was using surplus cherries in the Otago region. They spoke to me about their process sourcing this surplus food. And they said they actually found it really simple because they understood and operated in the same industry, offered the growers incentives, so payment and waste removal, sorted out the logistics themselves, so transport, machinery, and communication, and they entered into discussions with a fully fledged proposal when they went to these businesses to ask for their surplus. So that leads on to the recommendations that I created from this data. So the first one is solicitation matters. I think social enterprises should approach with a clear plan, like the organization using the surplus cherries in Central Otago. So have a plan for transport, storage capacity, the desired product and how much they can take of it, how communications will work, and also a sound understanding of the business and their product and processing facilities. The second recommendation would be to incentivize. Instead of treating it as if the business is doing you a service, I think they should go about incentivizing businesses, marketing the relationship as a win-win, and utilizing the cost incentive and the incentive of a secondary market for surplus. Additionally, I think prioritizing local, they'll have more success. I found even just in terms of a willingness to speak to me, local businesses, locally owned businesses were more willing. Often local businesses use their locality as a marketing strategy and may be more inclined to engage with a local social enterprise. And then lastly, to establish strong lines of communication. First, to ensure a long-standing relationship, and then also I thought there's definitely a possibility to investigate creating a surplus food redistribution platform to kind of amend these communication barriers that are popping up and connect food suppliers to potential recipients of surplus food, like is happening overseas. That's everything. Thanks.
Hello everyone, my name's Olivia and my research project this summer was called Archival Research on Early Settler Relationship to Place, and I undertook this with my supervisor Dr. Abbi Virens for the Centre for Sustainability. Our project explores early settler relationships to place, land and the environment in Dunedin from the mid to late 1800s. We've aimed to provide a new perspective by looking more at the settlers' effective emotional responses to the environment and nature, and how this shaped a sense of belonging. Using primary material like archives, including settler letters, diaries, photography, art, and drawings, like the one up here, we've been able to analyse the emotional connections and or disconnections being formed. Going into this project, we asked some key questions such as, how do we feel like we belong in place? How did the early settlers form emotional attachments to place? Did the physical transformation help to make the early settlers feel at home? And how do we, Pakeha, belong to a place that is not ours, but constructed to be ours? We were also curious whether elements of homesickness arose in relation to a disconnect to place and the native environment, as well as whether there were obvious feelings of awe or disgust. These questions have shaped the research which I will show over the remainder of this presentation. To answer these questions, this project has drawn on various ephemera from the Hocken collections, primarily those settler letters and diaries, but also ones like this. However, I initially started with a literature review of the discourse around Dunedin's early environmental history. And then from here, I took a very broad approach to the topic and spent quite a bit of time at the Hocken Library. After going through everything, Abbi and I agreed that the personal accounts of their first impressions, homesickness, as well as the accounts of bush clearing typically displayed this unique settler relationship the most and how it contributed to these individual effective responses to place and therefore the construction of belonging. So I'm just going to give a bit of historical context now to the Dunedin settlement and the environmental history literature. So the literature on the environmental history of the settlement of New Zealand has explored how settler ontology played a part in how the land was transformed into a settler image. New Zealand especially has drawn attention globally to environmental historians, such as the American ones like Alfred Crosby and William Cronon, as they have described New Zealand as a laboratory for studying the impact of concerted, culturally induced environmental change and the resulting production of new landscapes. New Zealand, as a relatively late settlement on a global scale, also allows for opportunity for better observation of these early settler environmental interactions as well. Much of the early settler history of Dunedin consisted of Edward Gibbon Wakefield, this guy up here, and the New Zealand Company. Wakefield has been described as the mastermind behind the large-scale European colonisation and settlement of New Zealand, beginning around the late 1830s. The New Zealand Company introduced their scheme to reproduce a slice of English life into New Zealand to create a kind of instant civilization in the new colonial environment. Beginning in 1844, Kaitahu made a series of land sales to the Crown and Company, including the Otago land block consisting of 500,000 acres, which was ultimately settled by the Scottish settlers of the Otago Association. As Dunedin became the primary settlement of the Otago settlement scheme, it developed a distinct Scottish and Free Church identity. Dunedin's founding members, like Thomas Burns and Captain William Cargill, loathed industrialism and urbanism and strived for a small concentrated community of farming Presbyterians. So when the settlers left their own industrial environment, they began to search for their own Virgilian Arcadia, or also known as a settler utopia. Much of the literature surrounding the early settlement of Dunedin has highlighted this theme of utopia, utopia meaning like an imagined place or a state of idealized perfection, and has been displayed in the archival research that we've conducted, as well as by many historians such as James Beattie and Tom Brooking, who I will reflect on throughout this presentation. Edward Gibbon Wakefield described his dreams for this utopian settlement as an entire British community, and not one merely formed of British materials, a community that shall carry away from the soil of Great Britain the manners, the institutions, the religion, the private and the public character of those whom they leave behind on it, and also they carry them away as to plant them in the new soil where they settle. This idea of utopia coincides with what is known as the era of improvement, which saw the physical transformation and refashioning of Dunedin's landscapes. The early settlers wished to recreate those from their homelands, which saw extensive bush clearing and included the acclimatization of familiar plants and animals to recreate this home-like environment. James Beattie has noted that over the 19th and 20th centuries, the settlers undertook the near wholesale replacement of native grasses and forests with introduced grasslands. This idea of the physical improvement of the landscape was enforced through biblical imagery that had been infused into settler society that influenced these expectations and descriptions of the Dunedin and Otago environment. For most European colonists, nature was seen as a commodity that was God-given and one that they felt that they had a right to exploit. James Beattie also noted that almost all settlers interpreted the Genesis creation account, in which God gave Adam dominion over nature, as giving humans the duty to understand and manage the natural world for the benefit of themselves. They believed that they were enhancing the natural environment rather than destroying it. They believed it was its destiny. Tom Brooking refers to this in correlation with Wakefield's ideas, is that the settlers imagined that Such extreme isolation and the pristine potential they found in Dunedin seem to have been disrupted by the Industrial Revolution. So Wakefield's plan gave them the means of converting wilderness into garden and of re-establishing the organic links between nature and community and individual and community, which had been destroyed by unfettered capitalism. So after this literature review of the early environmental history of Dunedin, I began my research at the Hocken. This painting up here is a great example of how this idea of utopia is being depicted in forms of ephemera. This is surveyor John Trimble Thompson's depiction of a view from Anderson's Bay in 1856 and is a vision of the landscape that Virens and the settlers wanted to create. As James has noted, Thompson's picture of this serene and tidy town presents a highly stylized vision of how its inhabitants wanted Dunedin to appear and shows the town peacefully laid out under the gaze of well-dressed sightseers. We can see that the flattened hills and the extent of native bush that has been reduced in the distance, as well as the stumps of the very few native plants left and the solitary cabbage tree and flax. However, my first impressions of these first impressions of Dunedin were heavily romanticized. My first impressions of the archival material in terms of the settler relationships to place consisted mostly of their first impressions of the environment and of Dunedin when arriving on ship through their letters and diaries. These first impressions of Dunedin were heavily romanticized. A common depiction tended to be something like this, where early settler Thomas Virens stated that is a most delightful and picturesque scenery. This romanticization played a fundamental role in the initial settler reactions and effective responses to the environment, as the first generation group of European settlers would undoubtedly have had high expectations for their new lives. Thomas Virens is a great example of a unique bush settler relationship. Virens migrated to Dunedin from England on the John Wycliffe in 1848, and he documented his shipboard experience and first few years on land in his diary, which is held at the Hocken. His initial impressions of Virens reflect that he was an active member of his community and was passionate about education, primarily religious-based, as he was a lay preacher of the Wesleyan Church. He provides some key insights into the mind of a settler, as he was one of the earliest arriving to Dunedin. He describes his first experiences in New Zealand and his interactions with the environment, specifically with the bush, and alludes that for him, it provided him with a form of religious sanctuary. This is shown by this quote from Virens, where he states that, oh how nature can bring a reflecting mind to the majesty, mercy, and providence of the Creator. And then continues by saying, the bush breathes into one a desire also to rejoice. However, other first impressions commonly were a comparison to the scenery of their homelands and the awe and how similar it was to Scotland especially. An example of this is from a passenger on the Philip Lang, who stated as sailing into the Dunedin harbour, how this is to the scenery of the Trossachs and Loch Katrine. This passage also displays the theme of romanticisation by stating, I have never seen anything to surpass the scenery of Port Chalmers in point of romantic beauty. However, despite these initial reactions, homesickness was also a common theme in the settler letters and diaries, and potentially was encouraged by a disconnection to place and the lack of a sense of belonging. But the settlers found that this lack of effective attachment could be solved by civilizing the land, which is also associated with the idea of utopia. An interesting theme I found during my research was how many of the settlers described the bush as beautiful, despite its untamed and wildness. However, the wilderness of the bush also encouraged feelings of loneliness and isolation, contributing to this disconnection to place, and is perhaps why the settlers were so steadfast on getting rid of it. Early settler Alexander Campbell Begg describes this effective response to the bush in his diary. He recalls walking through North East Valley one evening and states that I've never before experienced such a feeling of loneliness. He continues by saying, however, the sound of the axe in the distance tells how fast this wilderness is being reclaimed. This exemplifies settler ideas of bush clearing as not only necessary for the efforts at a settler civilization, but also as a response to the land and place providing discomfort, and an effective response to why they took such extensive approaches to removing it. After looking at all this evidence I'd gathered from the Hocken, Abbi and I found that it was these accounts of the bush and the personal accounts of clearing it that are exemplary in displaying individual effective responses to place in the environment. Beck also describes his association with bush clearing and states in his diary that the scrub was very thick, almost impenetrable, and I found it rather hard work at first. Quotes like these provide an insight into the individual labour that contributed to the transformation of place and show the material, social, and emotional relationships being formed by this labour. It also seems as though there was great pride taken in participating in bush clearance. In a letter from a settler to the New Zealand Journal in 1849, they stated that it is very hard work clearing. My hands have begun to blister and swell, but that will soon be as a tale is told. Their hard labour was seen as a sacrifice for what they believed was the greater good perhaps being the image of their settler utopia, where a place was considered beautiful but destined for more in terms of colonial settlement. As settler James Flint stated in his diary in October 1860, the coast looks beautiful and wants only the hand of man to cultivate the seeming wilderness and to make a really splendid sight. Overall, throughout this project, we have conducted exploratory research into early settler environmental relationships, as has been briefly shown throughout this presentation. This has ultimately revealed opportunities to better understand how the individual labour of bush clearing contributed to settler colonisation. Literature review and our own archival research has displayed ideological motives like settler utopia as facilitating relationships to place, and has reflected the resulting physical transformation of the landscape and its effective impact. As historian Rosalind McLean has noted, destinations like Otago became known and familiar, possibly more familiar than London or New York, despite their distance. And in an environmental context, this has occurred through bush clearing and other environmentally transformative efforts where individual effective relationships are being formed. Through this, we have found connections and or disconnections to place, land, and the environment, which has contributed to a better understanding of early settler belonging and how this relates to contemporary settler society. I'd like to thank the Centre for Sustainability and Abbi especially for allowing me to undertake this project. I've absolutely loved my time working at the centre and being able to spend my summer doing something that I love. Ngā mihi nui.
Kia ora. So my name is Jodie. I'm a Masters of Science Communication student, and I've been lucky enough, like Olivia, to work in the Centre for Sustainability this summer. My project is called Anticipating Future Technologies, Exploring Green Hydrogen in New Zealand Media, and I'm working with Abbi Virens as well, and also the GNS Green Hydrogen Program. I've had a really great time working on this project, and I've learned so much, so I'm going to just tell you a little bit about it. So because green hydrogen is an emerging technology, there's a high chance that not many of us have encountered it before. So I thought I'd just start by explaining it. So hydrogen is made by splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen, and through electrolysis. Grey and brown hydrogen are already used as energy carriers in the refining processes, but these are called grey or brown because they use fossil fuels and they emit greenhouse gases. So green hydrogen, however, differs here because it is produced using renewable electricity and has no emissions except for water. So for this reason, it's known as a clean energy carrier, and it's seen as an alternative to fossil fuels. So you might now be wondering why New Zealand is so excited about it. So with greenhouse gas emissions accelerating the effects of climate change, New Zealand has promised to reduce its emissions and decarbonise its energy sector. It's the Zero Carbon Act 2019. New Zealand committed to a target of net zero carbon by 2050. But the general scientific consensus is that we are not changing things fast enough to achieve this. So green hydrogen is being presented as a way to reduce these emissions in industries that rely on fossil fuels currently, but are hard to electrify. So this includes commercial trucking, aviation, shipping, and also manufacturing fertilizers. So New Zealand has a highly renewable electricity system and capacity to increase this. Green hydrogen is also seen as a tool to support regional economic transition, as well as increasing national energy security and independence as well. There's also a lot of talk about export and potentially helping other countries decarbonise their economies when they don't have as much renewable capacity as we do. So at the moment, it's limited to industry pilots and demonstration models. So the public isn't interacting with it a whole lot. So it's tricky to know what the social impacts of green hydrogen will be, as it remains so distant from us. Interestingly though, it features a lot in New Zealand media at the moment. So these are some examples. There's news reports, industry blogs, web pages, podcasts. So while we can't see how the public is interacting with the technology, we can see how it's being discussed online and the likely information that you might encounter if you're looking for, to learn about green hydrogen. So this kind of gives us an idea of what is already being said about green hydrogen. So for my summer project, me and Abbi looked at how green hydrogen is being presented in New Zealand media. So as I already said, the public don't interact with green hydrogen right now. So the media offers a great opportunity to see what a role it will play for people and what people's understandings might be. So there is currently very little social research on green hydrogen, and the existing studies focus on acceptability, which fails to capture the wider ideologies at play. Energy is something that sustains our communities and powers life, and so integrating social dynamics and ensuring equitable access in this research is really important. So before my research, there was a summer student called Calum, and he did a very similar study. So he was a linguistics student, so he actually looked at specifically the language that was being used, and his main finding was the heavy use of economic terminology. So as you can see here, researchers share knowledge with millions, and he noticed a real lack of climate or technical terminology, rather than articles focus on business outcomes and economic opportunity rather than linking emissions to climate change or our energy systems to people in place. Abbi wanted to build on this to encompass more characteristics of articles, not just language, and also gather more and kind of newer evidence for this narrative, see if this was still continuing a year later. So that is where my research comes in, although I had a little bit of an inkling based on Calum's findings, what I would find. So basically I took online written text. So we expanded this from Calum's research to include industry and government reports and web pages. So basically I searched green hydrogen in New Zealand into Google to kind of mimic what the public would find or might likely encounter. And I took 51 written articles published between 2019 and December 2023 when I started the project, and basically looked at what was the repeated characteristics or what was a typical narrative for it. So then after doing that, getting some idea of what kind of the more typical articles were, we used critical discourse analysis to really delve into these in depth. So discourse can be defined as an institutionalized way of thinking, talking, and acting that reinforces action and thereby exerts power. But a simple way to put it is just what are people saying about green hydrogen, what's being said, what's being communicated. So instead of just language, we looked at composition, layout, symbolism, the science communication. We looked at the context and the authors, so who were the main people talking online about green hydrogen as well. And so for each article, I answered all these questions about what was the symbolism present, how was the science being communicated, who were the experts brought onto the article. And then with all of those, I compared and contrasted them with the help of Abbi as well, so that we would make it, avoid any kind of bias between researchers. So we both looked at that and used them to understand the overall effect that was being put out about green hydrogen. And this reveals the dominant or most occurring narrative or discourse about green hydrogen. So it tells us the assumptions that are being made and how these are being communicated to the public. So unsurprisingly, very similar to Caleb's results. So what I found was, I think the hardest part about this project was actually the amount of things I found. There was so many themes that I could have gone into because it was very much, I think all the articles were using the same kind of sources. And so it was all very repetitive. And so it was very easy to find that kind of one collective narrative. So we kind of found so many themes that I had to kind of tie it in somehow. And we really quickly realized that all of this relates to the idea that it's presented as a business concept and not a technological or climate concept. So the most common subtopics that we found were business collaboration. So who is looking at green hydrogen right now? Investment, export, so the potential for New Zealand to export green hydrogen, and urgency, not climate urgency, but economic urgency. This idea that we needed to get on board this now, and this opportunity would pass us by if we didn't seize it. And so the other side of that is the things that were absent, and that's very few of them explained actually what green hydrogen is, which, when you're a member of the public trying to find information, that's quite confusing, and I guess just hard to navigate from there if you don't actually know what it is. And then also there's no explicit links to climate change. Often articles didn't actually link the idea of using green hydrogen to decarbonise to climate change and our country's climate goals. And there was few links to renewable energy consumption, even though that's a huge part of the energy system, and also a lack of information about public or community engagement, or what, on a community level, or what the public would want to see. And the authors along with this were frequently finance or economic writers. The experts were industry actors. There's a lot of really cool science going on about green hydrogen, but a lot of that didn't come through in these articles. So yeah, I've got some examples quite similar to what Caleb found as well, of some of the language used, lots of cliches related to urgency and just money and economic growth. So yeah, I think, knowledge worth millions really kind of paints a good picture for it. And also this idea of New Zealand being unlocked for development, and that idea that, we're somehow wasting this quick opportunity if we don't unlock it. And so here is a visual that Abbi created to show just kind of what we found, illustrator. And one of the most surprising things was that technology was one of the absent themes. It was very rarely kind of explained the actual technology behind green hydrogen. It was that investment, economics, and urgency, and economic urgency, not climate urgency, that was communicated. So that was really surprising. Cool, so what does this mean for green hydrogen in Aotearoa? So all of these articles understand energy as a commodity and fail to incorporate a socio-cultural understanding of resources. And despite green hydrogen being more sustainable, this narrative is reminiscent of that of fossil fuels previously, the idea of putting growth and economy before people in place in terms of energy. It separates energy system from its social, political, and, as we saw, environmental dimensions. And it's even though it's just the way we're talking about it, how we form this knowledge and understand it can really play a huge part in the results. And the opportunity of green hydrogen should not just be looked at as an economic opportunity, but also an opportunity to foster a more just and equitable energy sector. And none of these narratives are challenging current inequities in our energy sector. So to summarise, green hydrogen is presented as a low emissions energy alternative to fossil fuels for hard to abate industries in New Zealand. Contemporary media analysis like we did, me, Abbi and Calum, showed that green hydrogen is being introduced as a business concept rather than a technological or climate concept, which neglects really important social, political and environmental dimensions. And these, again, fail to challenge current inequities in the energy sector and make for a just energy transition. I have a couple of thank yous as well. Glad Hugh's just walked in because he's on there. I just wanted to say I was lucky enough to go to the New Zealand Hydrogen Symposium last week, which was really validating for actually seeing a lot of what we found in our research come across in the presentation of the talks as well. So thank you to GNS, to the team at the Centre for Sustainability for the best morning tea quizzes, and to my green hydrogen whānau that I went on the symposium with, because I learned a lot, whether that was to do with green hydrogen or not, or just how conferences work. Cool, so that's me. Thank you. Just gonna
Can I invite the three speakers that we've just heard from to come up and take a seat? You're going to do the roving mic. Thanks, Ray. So just a reminder for some of you who might have just come in during the presentation. So we've heard 15 or so minute presentations from our three speakers. Now we're going to do a nice Q&A and emphasis on the nice. No tricky questions. I'll save my tricky questions to the end maybe. Anybody in the room want to kick us off with a question?
Kia ora, Cinamin. Excuse me, Cinamin. We have emerging subscription things to Wonky Box and stuff like that, that individuals who can afford it can buy surplus vegetables, ones that would have gone to landfill. Do you see a tension, an issue with social enterprises wanting to access these surplus type vegetables and food, and others better off being able to just subscribe and get it delivered? And will that create supply issues for the social enterprises?
Can you repeat that one more time?
I get a lot of money. I'm paid as a professor. I can put in a subscription service to buy wonky vegetables, and I feel I'm doing a wonderful thing for the planet. As those services get taken up more and more by the affluent, will they divert surplus away from the social enterprise efforts?
Right, I see what you're saying. One of the businesses I actually spoke to had that same kind of sentiment, which is why they were more interested in donating than giving to social enterprises, because, I mean, WonkyBox is technically a social enterprise, but this business worried that the social enterprise aspect, so the social good, providing food cheaply to those who need it, is going to get like shifted, and then that food is going to affluent people who don't necessarily need it. So that was definitely something that was kind of reiterated. I think in terms of running out of a supply of surplus, that seems relatively unlikely. I feel like there is a lot of surplus that could be tapped into, but I think there is this kind of issue of the surplus going to affluent people instead of those in need.
Thank you.
If that answers it.
Good answer.
Thanks, everyone. They were all really, really interesting talks. Jodie, your experience of going to the conference and being part of this green hydrogen team from the perspective of someone, I guess, from the humanities or, you know, a non-engineering person in this space, how did you find it? Because I know lots of engineers and they're very, they're Mr. Fix-Its, you know, they love to go in and solve a problem and get technical stuff, but they don't often think about the sort of human dimensions of the work they're doing. How did you sort of navigate some of that, do you think, in the project?
Yeah, I think definitely the conference felt very, like I said, validating of those experiences of social impacts not being considered. we found that a lot of it was, yeah, very technical, and then the social impacts were kind of squeezed in the last day, and it was very, very different, obviously, and probably to people in engineering just as much as some of their talks were far out of my experience or knowledge. I think it was probably the other way around as well for them. So yeah, that definitely showed, and I found that a lot of the presentations, even one of the opening speeches, a lot of the languages and the cliches in terms of urgency, and there's a lot about green hydrogen being transformative and being this like to like supercharge our like energy sector and its economy, and a lot of that was just being said in some of the first talks. So it was, if anything, it just made me more sure that what the people that I was working with and social team were doing was really valuable, if that makes sense.
Just follow up on that. Do you think there's a reflection of, you were looking at what was being presented in the media, and then in the conference, you're sort of, these were the industry that's trying to create a business and industry, they would be putting out the press releases, and then that's being picked up by the journalists. Do you think there was some reflection there, I guess, in the speed at which articles need to be turned around by journalists, and the lack of sort of investigative journalism that might be sort of a symptom of what's happening at the moment?
Yeah, definitely. And I spoke to a few people about the trade-off of wanting, especially like some of the engineers talking about the trade-off of wanting people to be really interested in it and wanting people to invest, and so having to like, or feeling like they had to sensationalize it a bit in that respect, and also, yeah, all of the sources kind of being from the same pool, and so everything very, and like they were all very repetitive. There wasn't a whole lot of, in the media, there wasn't a whole lot of diversity in articles. So I do think that definitely plays a huge part, and it was really refreshing to see articles that had a new perspective, because they were quite rare. Even just ones that focused on renewables to begin with, or mentioned that first and explicitly its link to green hydrogen, was really good to see, and that was a rare occasion. So yeah.
I've got a question, which is predictably on the one that was about the Scottish narrative of Dunedin. Yeah. Did you, as you were looking at those archives, have any aha moments or insights about how that whole phenomenon of coming here for the utopian future has actually tracked through into how we talk about our place here now?
Yeah, there was one thing that like I came across was like in the literature review about street signs and stuff, and I just like never really put that together before, how just naming streets after ones from home and things from back in Scotland was a form of comfort for them, because that's typically what I like initially focused on at first, was like the whole thing about familiarity and those kind of things. So yeah, relating it back to like contemporarily to today, like yeah, it was, yeah, there was just so much to like the Hocken. It was crazy. I spent like 4 weeks just having aha moments.
Great. The suburb of Helensburgh. I'm from the original Helensburgh in Scotland.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So
did I get everything right?
Yeah. And the view, yeah, I could see exactly that.
Yeah,
So
it was like crazy how many of the settler diaries and stuff like specifically stated how much it reminded them of Scotland. Yeah, it was quite cool. I mean, obviously there's that idea of like the romanticization and like them wanting to see Scotland in the environment, but it was so common that there was definitely like obviously like that aspect of attachment there because of how similar it looked. Yeah.
One of the sessions after the afternoon tea break is going to be looking at a project that's regenerating native forest that's been pastoral land for 150 years. And I think thinking about North Dunedin, Studentville, and that's a place that could do with some regeneration. Do you think any ideas from your time in the archives and thinking about this first wave of settlers and the way that they've shaped a landscape, and then you know, if we were to try and regenerate North Dunedin, you know, what would your views be around a way to be able to do that that's kind of sympathetic to the community that we have at the moment?
Yeah, I'm not really sure how to answer that question. It's like something I haven't really thought about. I definitely think it's important that we do, you know, respect the native environment more than it has been. Yeah, I don't really know what to say on that, but yeah, it's something that I am wanting to get more in. Then I'm thinking about gardens, especially doing that on my honours dissertation on that. But yeah, I really want to get more into like how they started to have regrets towards what they did to the environment and those kind of things. That's like something I'm planning on looking more into, and how they yeah, changed what they were doing.
Any other questions from in the room? I don't think we have any online. Okay, in that case, let's just thank all of our 3 speakers again for their great presentations and a good Q&A, so thank you. So we now have an afternoon tea break, and we'll be kicking off again at 3 o'clock with a talk about forest regeneration.